When people imagine a medieval king at table, they usually imagine excess first. But spectacle is easier to remember than routine, and easier to paint than truth. The image is familiar, the certainty is not. The real Plantagenet table may have been less theatrical and more revealing. A king's ordinary meal could still be rich, but rich is not the same as extravagant, and daily access is not the same as festival display. So what exactly could Henry II expect to find before him on an ordinary day? Before we describe the king's food, we have to ask a harder question. What can the sources actually bear? Before we imagine a medieval king's table, we need to separate evidence from fantasy. What survives is often uneven. Some courts left recipes, account rolls, or ceremonial records. Others survive in fragments, objects, images, stray references, and archaeology. So the goal is not to invent a perfect menu. It is to rebuild the food world as honestly as the sources allow. To understand Henry's table, we have to begin with fragments. Henry II did not leave us a neat daily menu. What survives instead are traces, administrative, narrative, material, that let us glimpse his food world in pieces. The difficulty is not total darkness. It is uneven light. What vanishes most easily is repetition. The ordinary meal leaves fewer dramatic witnesses than the great ceremonial feast. That is why medieval food history so often mistakes theater for routine. We cannot recover every plate, but we can recover the system, what had to be baked, cut, poured, carried, and ranked to sustain a king. And that system begins far from the high table. Henry II did not rule from one still point. His court moved, and his food moved with it. Every journey changed what the household had to secure next. Before venison, before wine, before ceremony, there was bread. Royal power rested on staples made dependable. The king's table began in heat, labor, and timing. A royal meal was not only cooked, it was organized. Every vessel, every cut, every arrival in the hall had to happen in order. One of the most common mistakes in popular history is treating the grand banquet as daily routine. Feast food was political theater. It announced hierarchy, abundance, and control. Daily court meals could still be rich, but they were shaped by calendar, supply, religion, and household rhythm. A spectacular table and an ordinary royal supper were not always the same thing. Once we separate theater from routine, Henry's table becomes easier to see. By the time food reached the king, much of its meaning had already been decided in the labor required to prepare it and in the order in which it would be served. At the ordinary royal table, bread was not filler. It was structure, daily, expected, and socially legible. Even the loaf could signal rank. Ale remained part of the English food world. Wine carried prestige, refinement, and a wider horizon of trade. At court, access to each mattered. A king did not need a festival to eat well, but ordinary privilege looked different from feast abundance. Fewer signals, less theater, the same hierarchy. The king's meal was sustained by repetition: bread, drink, cooked dishes, fish in season or supply, and the dependable labor that made recurrence possible. But some foods carried more than nourishment. They carried prestige. To hunt was to exercise privilege in the landscape itself. Game belonged not only to appetite, but to rank, land, and royal identity. But prestige in the forest still had to become food in the hall. Venison arrived with symbolism attached. But in the kitchen it became weight, timing, spoilage risk, division, and work. A hunted animal did not feed the court by prestige alone. Fish did not need the symbolism of the hunt to matter. River supply could feed elite households with a steadier rhythm than spectacle ever could. The royal table depended as much on water as woodland. Royal food was not gathered at random. It moved through managed landscapes, obligations, and household channels that made the king's access feel natural because it was enforced. And nowhere did that control become more visible than at the feast. Feast food was not simply more food. It was ordinary hierarchy expanded into public theater. Here, the meal had to be seen as much as consumed. At feast, service itself became part of the message. Order approached the king in human form. At court, food was never just nourishment. It moved through systems of taxation, tribute, labor, hunting, storage, trade, and ritual service. Who received white bread, imported spice, fine ceramics, or first access to meat was part of a language of rank. The royal table was one of the clearest stages on which power became visible. What changed at feast was not only quantity, but visibility. Ceremonial abundance made hierarchy legible at scale. The feast announced what daily life already knew. The feast did not invent rank. It illuminated it. The difference between supper and spectacle was real. But ceremony worked because it magnified habits the court already lived by. At a royal table, even bread could reveal social geometry. Fineness, nearness, and order belonged together. Rank could be tasted before it was spoken. Food did not travel evenly across the hall. It moved by degree, and degree was one of the court's native languages. Nourishment was shared. Privilege was measured. The king's meal was a small model of the world around him. Access, sequence, and privilege made authority visible enough to eat. Which is why myth still gets Henry's table wrong. The evidence does not support a king living in permanent banquet mode. That fantasy survives because spectacle leaves louder traces than routine. The truth is quieter, but more exact. To understand Henry's food, we have to value repetition over display. Bread, drink, fish, meat, labor, rank, and the habits that made kingship feel permanent. And in that repetition, power becomes easier to see. The table did not need constant magnificence to remain unequal. The king's daily meal was less theatrical than myth, but more revealing of how Plantagenet rule actually worked. What made the Plantagenet table powerful was not endless abundance. It was controlled abundance, better food, better access, and the authority to make that inequality look natural. The king's supper was never only supper. We cannot place every dish before Henry II with certainty, but we can see the world that kept feeding him, and the ranks that world sustained. The honest version of history is often quieter than myth. Sometimes we can identify a dish, a vessel, or a serving order with confidence. Sometimes all we can recover is a pattern. That caution is not a weakness. It is what keeps historical storytelling from turning into costume fantasy. And that pattern reveals more than a menu ever could. Henry's table mattered not because it escaped the limits of the medieval world, but because it decided who lived nearest to privilege and who labored furthest from it.